I'm doing well, David.
Man, I'm really excited to share this episode with y'all. In just a little bit, we're going to be talking with Alex Hochuli, whom I'm a big fan of. Been listening to Bunkcast for a while. Love the book, The End of the End of History, and taking an in-depth look at Alex's new piece in American Affairs on the millennial left, or the populist moment, however you want to categorize that. It's a fun interview. Really, it's like that's the kind of stuff I like talking about, is sort of taking lessons from this pretty wild past 10, 15 years of global left politics.
Yeah, I mean, his review covers two books. I haven't read the Catron book, but Yeager and Bevan's I have. And yeah, it's making me feel a little bit old. Talking about these milestones that I saw as like a young man, helped me orientate myself in this fucked up planet. And, paths not taken, But yeah, it's a good conversation. And yeah.
100%. Well, we'll jump to that in just a second. Just reminder, folks, we're taking a little break here from Left Reckoning just for a week or so. I'm getting married, so we'll have this episode up, but we're not going to have a bonus this weekend, so we can hang out and celebrate and my friends and family.
I'll be in Austin, Texas. I'll be with R.M. Brown, maybe. I don't know who was. Who are we getting to the honky tonk?
We got a lot of good folks, a lot of good friends.
Sorry.
Folks, y'all can't come though, so that's what give the address out. I know, really, we do love all of y'all so much, and I've got some really nice messages from folks and appreciate it. Very happy and blessed, and for my wonderful soon-to-be wife, and for this really lovely community here at Left Reckoning. So thank all of y'all. We'll be back.
And a great wedding present would be becoming a member at patreon.com.
Yes, sir. That would be a great wedding present. So why don't you go and do that, patreon.com/Left Reckoning. We'll be back soon with a lot of really, really great stuff. And this interview upcoming is a part of that. A really great talking with Alex. So friends, see you soon, and take care. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined by Matt as always. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing well. Good to be with you, David.
Yeah, man. I mean, we're stoked to introduce our guest, the second-time appearance, Alex Hochuli, who is the author of The End of History, also co-hosts the excellent podcast, Bunkcast. I'm a Bunga boy, a Bunga man. I don't know what we call ourselves, but I'm
well, we call ourselves Bunga boys. So, like, I guess I don't know.
But I'm a huge fan of your work and your co-host work as well, and really thrilled to be chatting to you as always. And this time we have you on to talk about this new piece that you wrote in American Affairs. Let me put it up on the screen for folks. Omelets with eggshells on the failure of the millennial left. So yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. Always like talking to you.
Thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure.
Well, I mean, there's a lot in here, and this is, I think, a topic that a lot of us are very interested in. Is sort of trying to categorize the 2010s and what those kind of political moments meant, particularly for the left. And I was thinking, maybe just to start us off, in the title, it uses the term millennial left. I know in Chris Cruchon's book, he uses that as well. I'm just curious, before we dive into it, how you sort of define that, how you categorize it, if that's a term that you prefer.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, actually. A couple of people have picked up on that aspect and gone, well, actually, why are you saying, don't you know generational politics is nonsense? And it's like, well, yeah, actually, we actually did a whole series about how generational politics is nonsense. But nevertheless, I think just to make a general defense of the use of it, when you're talking about specific traditions, so not society in general, maybe it makes sense in like pop music or whatever, but like when you're talking about specific traditions, like something like the left, right, where you have waves of activism, which conceive of themselves in different ways, focus on different things, it makes sense, I think, to speak of in generational terms, not that like everybody there is a millennial, or that the politics that the millennial left brought is a generational politics, like it being anti-boomer politics. I'm not suggesting that, even though there is too an element of that in there, of which I'm in fact critical. The point is just simply that, you have a wave of activism from the 1960s, which is the New Left, and it conceives itself as New Left against the Old Left. Then you have a generation that comes after that, which has imbibed of the failures of the New Left, and dedicates itself more to kind of subcultural, countercultural pursuits and whatever. This is the kind of Gen X left. And then you have the Millennial left, which is basically this wave of activism that follows the global financial crisis. And I mean, that's what I'm interested in talking about. If you want to say, it's silly to call it the Millennial left, fine, I'm not wedded to that. But the point is that other people are using this term, and I think it is, who are the leading kind of activists and people, kind of intellectuals even, in that in this moment, which runs not so much from 2008 immediately, but more from 2011 onwards. And the whole kind of Bernie moment, the whole Corbyn moment in the UK, etc. Not that like all the politicians and whatever are millennials. In fact, very much on the contrary in the case of like the UK and the US. But it's more just about those who came of age, kind of post global financial crisis and the world they encounter and the activism that they got involved in contrast to what was done before.
Yeah, and I mean, I really wanted to like dive into some of the specifics here, but as a younger guy, and this is sort of like was my introduction to politics. I mean, I remember when Cernik's and Alex Williams' book came out, for example. Paying a lot of attention to what's going on in Greece because, oh man, there's like a socialist party coming into power. Then Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders. One thing that and maybe this is just something that happens with time, but like. The height, like the real energy behind this movement, feels sort of short in the sense of the kind of political side. Even though this is like a long decades process that we can sort of talk about, like the actual activity of Syriza, of Jeremy Corbyn's movement, of the Bernie Sanders movement, both Corbyn and Sanders sort of have, a first and second act. One a little bit more impressive than the latter. But yeah, it is, I'm struck with how short this time period sort of feels looking back.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, we wrote a book, which its main idea is about the end of history period. Its second idea is the failure of left populism. Which is a term that we use, and we can get into again maybe the terminology around that. But to the extent we're talking about a broad thing, it can be interchanged with the millennial left or whatever. But we criticize that, and we were writing that book in 2019 into 2020, published in 2021. Really kind of going, okay, well, what's just happened with the start of the pandemic and the defeat of the second Bernie campaign and the defeat of Corbyn in the general election in 2019? Like, this thing's over, right? And at the time, it made sense to write about it because it was a thing that got a lot of people interested in politics again and made people feel hopeful for the left for the first time in ages, right? Like maybe since the anti-globalization movement, and I think to a larger degree than that. And so you could say maybe since the 70s or something, right? So, but if I were to write that book now in 2024, it's a good question about how much time we'd actually dedicate to that. I think the critique of it is very important. Because if you're on the left and you conceive of yourself as being on the left, that to not repeat the errors of that, which I think very serious errors, is the most important thing. So that it's still worth making the critique, but at the same time, it's also something which was so brief that it was like this kind of, maybe we'll look back on it as the last gasp of the left rather than some new beginning.
Well, I mean, I think maybe to sort of dive in here, how would you sort of define this millennial politics or left populism to folks? I mean, what are its kind of trademarks? I think maybe compared to other political movements today or even versions of the left in the past.
Right. I mean, I think firstly, it's anti-neoliberal. It's very it self-consciously conceived as being against neoliberal austerity, especially. So I think probably the unifying factor is the demand for better services. Better social services, more public spending, greater welfare, and associated to that, though maybe this is sometimes less clear in its self-conception, but it's responding to a crisis of politics, right? So to a crisis of representation, which is common to all quote unquote populism. In fact, populism arises at moments of where there's a crisis in representation, right? So people don't, and that goes for the right, it goes for the left, it even goes for certain centrist types of populism, as maybe like contradictory as those terms may sound to people. But you've got various examples. You got examples in Spain, for example, in France, whatever, of kind of a, even like Emmanuel Macron in France is like an example of a kind of centrist neoliberal populist, which might be like, well, okay, how do those things fit together? But the point being is that the common element is this crisis of representation. And so there's a general feeling across the West of they don't represent us. And sometimes that becomes a slogan. In Spanish-speaking countries, it was like it literally was a slogan, they don't represent us. And I think that maybe wasn't so clear in the minds of a lot of activists, but I think it was certainly the backdrop to it. And I think that's what's distinct about so it's anti-neoliberal and it's like response to this crisis of representation. Now, there's two moments in it, I think, really. The first moment is the kind of horizontalist occupation, streets occupation, whether it's Occupy, whether it's like the Arab Spring or people being inspired by the Arab Spring, the occupation of the squares in Southern Europe, various other protests around the world. Here in Brazil, we had our own moment in June of 2013, which set off a whole wave of consequences, which ended with Bolsonaro's election. So it took its twists and turns, but it started as something from the left. And then became something confused, and then became very right wing. That was the kind of first phase of it. And the second phase of it is suddenly this moment where there's a turn to electoral politics, which is like a real 180 about face, which happens, around 2015, where suddenly from the squares, from these occupations, from these manifestations, which had like all sorts of demands, it was a bit of a free-for-all, which in that regard were quite similar to the sort of alter globalization protests of like Seattle 99, Genoa, etc., that whole moment. It was similar in that regard, but then suddenly there's this turn towards, hey, what if we got executive power, right? What if we won elections? And suddenly people start talking about power, about winning, which we can get into kind of the pros and cons of that. But I think that it's important to conceptualize it, I guess, in those two moments. And that's something that applies, to, across quite a lot of countries, but it's clear in the US, it's clear in the UK.
No, I mean, absolutely. And I mean, I think this is why this bit of history is so fascinating. Because, there is a kind of very similar history in a lot of different countries with these movements, right? With their own quirks and uniqueness. But generally, like, there's a script you can follow, which, I don't know, just makes it a very interesting kind of puzzle to work through, because it means that there's something more than like, because you could look, for example, if you took like just an American-centric version of like Bernie Sanders' campaign, and you can come with all these theories about like, oh, if he would have said this, or if he would have done this, or if this would have happened, maybe he would have won. And look, maybe. But the fact that like we're just seeing this kind of calculus fall over and over and over across different contexts, I think means that there's something more fundamental here. And I think one of these things that is kind of interesting that you note in your piece about what you and the folks whose books you're reviewing were calling the left populist gamble, talking about how like there was like one thing is like you noted like moving from protest to politics, and that's the phrase that Leo Panch would use a lot. And there's a lot of excitement that the left was finally moving from doing protests and doing politics. But I think one thing that you sort of note in your piece, and I think is becoming more and more clear, is that there was a kind of naive attitude towards the state and power. And I was just curious if you could sort of talk us through a little bit of that, because I think that that's something that not only did these movements rub up against, but I remember very clearly one day sitting with Bhaskar Sankara, founder of Jacobin magazine, with Michael Brooks, and Bhaskar said something along the lines of like, if Bernie Sanders got elected president back in 2016, it would have been extremely disappointing. And like not advocating against it, but just sort of like, Bernie Sanders was going to be fighting for his life to get any of these things done.
Right.
And a lot of people were just sort of like, oh, we're going to win the election and roses are going to fall from the sky. And, we've done it.
Well, yeah, I mean, so there's an irony in this. I note several ironies in the way that actually there's a continuity between the kind of protest phase and the politics phase, even though they seem diametrically opposed and facing in different directions. There's like all these kind of terrible ways that things keep repeating themselves. So, Vincent Bevins in his book does this like neat little tweet style thing where like he satirizes the protesters who just basically like something happens, call people onto the streets, the police repress you, people get really angry, and then everyone else comes out on the street, blank space, good things happen, or like, government falls or something, so there's like this missing element where of strategy, where like you go from mounting this protest to like something good happening, or revolution, or even just changing the government or whatever. But actually the same thing repeats itself when you have this supposedly much more serious, more organized, more formal form of politics in fighting elections, trying to get Bernie Sanders elected, trying to get the Labour Party elected under Jeremy Corbyn, etc. Series of actually getting elected and forming a government, and actually able to represent the people, representing a large mass of people, not to be forgotten, right? And failing, right? And we can maybe return to the Greece case, I think, because as I mentioned several points in the thing, it kind of crystallizes a lot of the problems. And it's actually worth thinking through, because it puts you in the position of thinking, okay, well, what if Bernie Sanders did win, right? Or what if Corbyn did become elected prime minister? And there's this kind of blank space where we just kind of go, well, good things will happen. Okay, what things was the millennial left wanting to achieve? Well, I think at a kind of basic consensus minimum, a rollback of neoliberalism. And I say roll back because there isn't really any very much policy going on and thinking about how to restart growth, for example. I think most people on the left would kind of go, growth, what are you talking about? It's not interesting. I want to resolve equality. I want equality. I want less inequality. I want to eat the rich. I want to whatever, right? But actually, so there's no real. All it is kind of, let's roll back to the pre-neoliberal period and have that again, because we didn't need to do neoliberalism. That was bad. Let's just undo that. And therefore, what do you want? If you have a friendly left-wing government, they will then take care of people, and they'll do things like maybe increase taxation on the wealthy. They'll increase social spending, increase unemployment insurance. Maybe at the most kind of provides a jobs guarantee, which is a more sort of novel sort of thing. But basically, trying to maybe at the most, do a new deal, which ignores that we're in radically different circumstances to that which kind of led to the New Deal. That you had, for example, Revolutionary Threat, which or these revolutionary organizations, which which seriously challenged bosses' domination in the workplace and so on, which put fear into the hearts of the bourgeoisie. That doesn't exist now. So, I think you have to ask yourself serious questions about what is possible in those circumstances. So anyway, I think there's this kind of leap. And I remember we did an episode on Bunkercast back in 2019 going, okay, it looks like Bernie might win the Democratic nomination. It seems possible, like he had his go in 2016. Me looking from afar, you'd think, well, hopefully all the activist base and the leaders of the campaign and whatever have learned lessons from that and will be better and stronger now in 2019. Obviously it proved to be the opposite, because Bernie got dragged in fundamentally into the anti-Trump movement, and that actually completely defused its populist sort of energy and proposal. But nevertheless, there was this possibility that he would win the nomination and then potentially win against an unpopular Trump. And what then? So I was like trying to sketch out, okay, what do you do actually if Bernie, as from the left, what do you do in response to a Bernie government? Do you critique it? Do you try to push it leftwards? What is actually the relationship to this? And some people were like, why are you doing an episode on this? We have so much to actually still achieve till we get him there. And I'm like, well, yeah, but let's actually let's play this through, And I think there's not enough of that going on. I think that, as I say in the article, you can seize its executive power, right? And the imperial presidency has a great degree of power, but mainly abroad. So there's a limit to what you can do. So you're going to have a legislature which is probably going to be hostile unless you have a massive wave electing favorable congressmen, which wasn't going to be the case actually with the Bernie movement in the US. In the UK, far more favorable because it's a parliamentary system, but even then you have the parliamentary Labour Party who is largely set against Corbyn, right? They put the knife into his back. So that was unlikely to happen. And then that ignores the whole rest of the state. Right, that you basically got a judiciary which is going to do everything it can, including playing dirty to rule things out as illegal. You're going to have the deep state kind of conniving against you in all sorts of ways. You might have employers also kind of doing lockouts, trying to run the economy down, making people's lives hard. And then you've got even supranational institutions like the EU or hostile foreign governments which are hostile to your interests also trying to sabotage you. So, none of this is to say, give up on politics because because things are difficult, things are impossible. But I think without reckoning with that, you're not even, you're playing a very high stakes sort of poker, or pick your game. But that's the populist gamble, right? That you can just seize executive power, as Anton Jaeger and Arthur Borriello note in their book, as if by surprise. That suddenly you might just sneak in and become president, and then got you neoliberals. now we're holding the reins.
Yeah, and I mean, like the kind of bit I always do on the program is like Bernie had that slogan, "Not me, us," and I think there's a little bit like Bernie is a bit of a puzzling character to me because sometimes I do feel look, Bernie Sanders did something that I think really awoke a lot of potential in American politics that just didn't exist before, but not translating any of that movement into any kind of political form or organization, I find to just be a disastrous aspect of his legacy. Go ahead, Matt.
And it's especially interesting when you look back, and we've talked about Bernie in the early 90s, and he expressed his hesitancy to endorse Jesse Jackson. Like the weird thing about Bernie is you can find things of where he looks to get the actual critique that needs to be leveled at him.
Yeah, and I mean, but what I was saying is like, he has that slogan, like "Not me, us," and which like in a sense it sort of made sense in the like. Well, it was a nice one. I was like, oh, this is great. We love each other. We're looking out for one another. But like literally, it's like if you want to take on the course, you're going to have something bigger than just like this kind of political movement. But there was just zero work to actually achieve or create any kind of movement around that, right? It was just sort of like, oh, it's nice. Grandpa Bernie thinks about us, and he's not selfish and full of himself. Which in a kind of ironic way actually like elevated him to like a superhuman figure, because we'll just Bernie will do this when he gets into office. And there just wasn't a strong reckoning of what was going on, and I think more than anything there wasn't even a place to have that kind of reckoning or debate or argument in the US at least, right? Because it was an atomized like group of people coming to it from different things. Some people who watched a lot of political YouTube or TYT back in the day, some young socialists, some old head believers of, labor politics. There was a kind of, not only was there not a developed kind of political organization, I think, on the left in the US, there wasn't a really strong recognition of, one, how important it is, or two, even like a recognition of like, hey, we gotta build this like yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's different ways to conceive of this, but there's also, competition. Competition's good. This is one of the places like the left should be open to competition, especially, which is intra-left competition, right? That different groups, whether it's factions within a party or they're different parties competing against each other for the masses, right? And that has generally been a productive process, right? Where, you might have a party saying, look, we support Bernie, but not if he runs with the Democrats, or we are against the whole Bernie campaign because it's trying to kind of like reinvest in the Democratic Party, and the sooner that it struggles or dies, the better, whatever. And see who kind of wins out of that. And I think there's a tendency on the left to, especially today, conscious of the weakness and the absence of organizations, to kind of mollycoddle the left itself and to try to go, well, let's not critique because that might break things, or that might give ammunition to our opposition. But to return to kind of the kind of first point you were making, really the tragedy. I mean, I think the bare minimum that one would have expected to kind of endorse the Bernie campaign would have been for it to be premised on the fact that he might have spurred on a new organization from that, to use that organization to set up something new and to run against the Democrats. But of course, as soon as you're running as an anti-Trump candidate or buying into the necessity, the imperative of defeating Trump, then it becomes quite hard for you to set up a third party, which is obviously going to eat into Democratic votes and will put Trump in the presidency. Mm-hmm. And you have to go, yeah, that's fine. Let Trump be president. I mean, there's no, he's not any better or worse than the other guy. Maybe even better in some respects. Who cares? None of our business. Our business is a long-term project of social transformation, and we have to lump that. But the need for immediacy and for kind of achieving immediate wins always actually makes you into a sucker for like the electoral cycle and the whole American political system and the media circus that accompanies it is to me, it seems a whole means of impeding any kind of radical politics from ever emerging, because you're constantly getting caught up in the next cycle, the next fever, and then it dumps you out, and you're down, and you're like uninterested in politics for 2 years, and then you get reactivated for 2 years, and this has been the case for a long time. Maybe some younger people aren't aware of that, but I think that then it's the onus is on those who are a bit older to say, well, don't get sucked into this again.
Well, you use a term in your piece called short-termism, and I was curious if you could put some meat on that for the audience here, because I do think that is like a kind of strategic issue that you're sort of getting into there.
Yeah. So I make the point actually that the left, the millennial left, ended up reflecting back capitalism's worst tendencies in many regards, of being kind of anti-organization building, anti-institutional, in favor of kind of just controlling flows. So for example, capital is interested in controlling flows in terms of like gaining investment, and not really the state taking charge of leading investment. Well, what's the left doing? The left's trying to corral activists who are energized at election time to vote for a candidate, and then I don't know, hopefully they win, and then if they don't, nothing happens, or they do it all again later. And that also, connects to this short-termism, which we know that capitalism is obviously short-termist. It's focused on, for example, inflating stock prices rather than kind of long-term growth of a company, even, right? Even on its own terms, that's kind of prejudicial, let alone kind of thinking about the capitalist state focused on, politicians on winning the next election, the kind of general short-termism of politics, and the left in that regard as well. I mean, one of the kind of things that makes democratic politics of any sort, I don't mean kind of necessarily establishment politics, I mean democratic in the proper sense of it, the only that makes that possible is processes which are sometimes slow, like deliberation, which just sometimes take time. There's no way of rushing it, and all the attempts to rush it tend to be authoritarian, right? They attempt to be kind of like, let's clamp down on debate and some bureaucrat take a decision. And there's so many kind of forces within our society which try to accelerate things and make things immediate, shortening attention spans, for example.
You're right there.
Yeah, did I lose you? Did you lose me?
We're good.
Yeah.
We're good.
Okay. The kind of shortening attention spans, for instance. And the left, in theory, is the only force in society which can and should be long-termist, thinking about certainly not 4 years, not 8 years, but thinking about 20 years and maybe more, but thinking in that sort of time span. And that's hard because you don't get your quick wins. You don't get the kind of psychological payoff of getting all excited about this election cycle and then the next one and whatever. But otherwise, the road to hell is quite clearly paved in this kind of short-term cycles of immediacy and like increasing idiocy. And so the left has to be long-termist, has to be thinking in terms of building organizations which are capable of appealing to people and fighting, and also reckoning, I think, which is part of this, is that the left is very weak. Exceptionally weak, if the left exists at all, and I go back and forth in it. It either exists and is terrible, or it doesn't exist at all. And to the extent that it does exist, it needs to be conscious of that weakness and to do one thing. I don't know what that thing is, right? And we can think. I think that in many ways politics has to kind of go back to basics, but you need to be on one thing. Focus on, for example, like clawing back time from employers, right? Shortening the working day at the same wages, whatever. I think that might be a good one. But, the left can only do one thing, and the fact that the left tries to do everything all the time is a failure. I mean, just take one example, because I think I mentioned it in the piece we'll make some reference to Chile, right? So Chile had this massive uprising, right, at the end of the last decade, which led to a new constitutional assembly, which was in a way a means of the establishment kind of falling off the street protests, kind of getting it to cool down, like, okay, fine, we'll do a new constitution, which is a major thing, but the street protests could have pushed further, I think, in really taking down the establishment. But anyway, there we are. What does the left do? Rather than it does some good stuff, like, for example, getting rid of the second chamber, so making it like a unicameral system. which can't be overruled by the grandees who are stuck there in Senate. Right, good thing. And there's some other kind of slimmed down kind of constitutional measures, which are, or not constitutional measures, but ways of writing the Constitution, which really focus on popular power, on democracy. But what does it do? It also piles in with a bunch of kind of like quote unquote woke kind of demands and pet causes and various other kind of guarantees about social spending and blah 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 blah, which are often not worth the paper they're written on. And so the left kind of piles in like, oh cool, we have an opportunity here. Let's try to do it. Let's pile in everything, not recognizing the moment is always going to be short. Is always going to be ephemeral. The investment of the masses in that project is going to also be short, and needs to have gains, have wins. And what happened in Chile is precisely that they didn't provide that. They piled in a constitution with loads of stuff, and because of, broadly speaking, the crisis of representation around the world, and the anti-politics of the masses, kind of rejection of the political establishment, very well grounded one, they quickly fell foul of of the majority, and the majority voted down the constitution, which they had invested so much effort into to elaborate. And so the promise that the Chilean activists made, that the country which first introduced neoliberalism would be the first country in which it dies, unfortunately, didn't prove to be a reality. So, and
it's such a shame. And I think that like that episode is, if you were to want to write, the book on those periods, like that is the bookend. In my opinion, in a lot of ways. Who knows? Maybe there'll be more chapters or anything like that. But I wanted to talk a little bit because I think this Chilean constitution sort of touches on, I think, a fundamental thing that we have to talk about. It's like we're talking about strategy, orientation, all those kind of things, but we have to think about like the makeup and the ideas of this movement, class makeup, social makeup, because I think the Chilean constitution, it really did highlight that like it had, not only was it like there's too much in there, but it's like this real anxiety that you see amongst leftists, where it's like if you don't talk about everything, then you're like against it. Right. So it's like if you want to say like, oh, this is a bad thing that's happening to this group, you also say, well, there's other groups that are also affected by really bad things, too. And like one, I think that's bad messaging and all that. But I think it actually like gets to something deeper in the kind of psychological makeup of this group. But, and I think it's notable that even in a country like, Chile, which is different in some respects than the United States, you see, again, these similar kinds of forms and anxieties and ways of talking and ways of being. So let's talk a little bit about like this kind of class social makeup of this millennial left and how you would sort of categorize it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly well known that the left, certainly in terms of like its activist base and support, or even in terms of looking at the voting patterns and looking at the class breakdown of political parties, you have what Thomas Piketty called the Brahmin left, where I think the radical left is not a huge amount better than this, right? It's often based in kind of professional middle class, often downwardly mobile middle class, people who, unlike their parents or grandparents, find that they struggle to buy a house, burdened with educational debt, and so on. Now, none of that's a problem, right? Like, that's not, I don't think we should be like essentialists and say, oh, you're middle class, I'm middle class, kick me out, Like, I think we have to think part of thinking politically is also kind of thinking beyond yourself, right? And it was always the case that proletarian movements often had kind of leaderships or intellectuals who were from middle class backgrounds, but it's about your political allegiance to the cause and to the cause of socialism, and that's what's fundamental, not specifically who your parents are or what you do for a job or whatever. But the problem is that once you get to an aggregate level and you're looking at it and you're like, well, nearly everyone here is middle class, then obviously their interests will prevail. Now, it doesn't mean that an alliance or some sort of coalition is impossible, but one would expect, nevertheless, that that kind of the middle class interest will prevail. So the focus on student debt, entirely valid. But it would be better, I think, if the middle class would speak in its own name rather than trying to pretend to be speaking for the working class, and just say, well, this is for kind of mainly middle class people who go to university, but actually it'd be really good to stop this kind of burdening and this pile up of debt, which will free people and all the economic consequences of that let's just do that, and this is for us, but I think there is an allergy to interest, and I don't mean economic interest. I mean your self-interest on the left. Like there's this idea that you need to be doing good things for other people. You need to be the caring type who tries to protect other people from harm and so on. But left-wing politics, radical politics, was always traditionally based on self-interest, right? I mean, the self-interest of the working class, in some degree, at least in some immediate sense, in working class advancement. And people doing it for themselves and with their own organizations. So I think once you lose that, you get a kind of middle class do-gooder thing going on, which becomes even more apparent now that the populist moment has definitely passed of 2015, 2016, 2017, where there was genuine working class interest in the sort of left populist gamble, at least. For all the problems that we know that it had. But, once that evaporates again, it exposes ever more the kind of class basis of that. And, the left is able to turn to other phenomena and say, but you see, that just expresses the interest of, small business owners, or this expresses the interest of the financial bourgeoisie, or this expresses the interest of, blah, 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 right? But it's unable to do it with itself. And then say, well, actually, most likely the reason that these things are being pursued, because it's like the kind of somewhat the Chilean constitution, or this idea of like piling all your pet causes on. I mean, Christopher Lasch was right. That is narcissism, right? It's narcissistic in the sense of it being self-focused, that you need to have yourself represented and care about what I care about animals, and therefore I need to make sure veganism gets its say in there. To pick up a really ridiculous example, which I don't think many people would take seriously. But, I don't think any of the other examples, are supposedly more serious cases, are necessarily that much better. And so that narcissism, the contrast to that would be far more instrumental politics and far more kind of cold-blooded sense of, okay, look, we need to be very strategic about this. We need to be instrumental, and we need to build organizations which are focused on doing this thing and that thing alone.
Well, Ben Fong, our friend, and I've had him on show recently talk about his new show on Jackman, which people should be listening to. He had a great essay in Damage magazine, I think I'm forgetting the title, but something along the lines of towards a radical minimalism. Yeah. Right. Which is with so much of the left is we have to speak about everything. It's we can actually, as a movement, say, hey, we're just not involving ourselves in whatever this issue is. We're here for working class emancipation, working class power, wages, whatever. And I found that piece to be really good and very much against the sensibilities of a lot of folks. But going back to interest politics, I have to ask you on that point though, because I think one thing that's very clear, for example, about the Labor Party, is that social class that ended up being very influential in the Labor Party, which was wealthy, middle class, liberals, leftists, whatever you want to call them in London, who were horrified at Brexit, oftentimes for very much cultural reasons, or for very cynical, I don't want to have to wait in line when I'm going to Spain on vacation, right? Kind of stuff, right? So there, and that might be a genuine interest, for them. It's a stupid one, but it's a genuine one. So how to advocate that group of people recognize that the fight for breakfast was a fight for the fight for Brexit was a fight for democracy, and for building a different kind of politics. That's an interest that you actually might see just genuine clashes between the working class base that we would want to construct on the left and this group of people who ends up having a lot of influence in left-wing politics. Yeah,
no, absolutely. This is why I called the piece "Omelets with Eggshells," right? Because it's they want to make an omelet, but they don't want to break the eggs. So, what you end up with, right? And, breaking the eggs there might be breaking with the Democratic Party. It might be leaving the EU. But, a whole series of neoliberal institutions, or neoliberalized institutions, which the left is actually pretty comfortable with. They like the institutions. It's kind of fine. It's cozy. We just want changes in policy. And that's just a failure of political analysis. And, with the case in Britain, I think it's very clear. They tried to wield together a coalition, which worked for a little while in 2017, while Corbyn said, I'm going to honor the referendum. But, what happened in Britain was exceptional with all the establishment I mean, people will always go, oh, but you had this capitalist actually in favor of Brexit, or blah, 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 or you had this newspaper in favor of Brexit. No, let's be serious. The vast bulk of the establishment was in favor of remaining within the EU, as they should be, because it is a conservative institution. And the working class, nevertheless, again, you can say, well, there's some sections of the working class didn't vote for Brexit. Yes, there's all these exceptions. Broadly speaking, the less well-to-do people, and especially the parts of the country that are less well-to-do and definitely kind of forgotten. The regional inequality in the UK is exceptionally big. Those people voted, despite all the fear-mongering, to leave the EU. You know what? Fuck it. Let's do it. Let's break this thing. And the left just didn't want to reckon with that, and it kind of went, well, but look, we need to focus on neoliberalism. We need to focus on these policies. We need to help welfare. What are we fussing around with this supranational institution and whether in or out? That's just a mere constitutional matter, rather than understanding it as absolutely fundamental and foundational and a major support for kind of neoliberal rule, the ability to outsource decisions to kind of European level. And also the simple fact that if you had a socialist government in the UK, not only would certain policies not be allowed, but it would be a massive kind of wedge in any left government, which would do everything in its power to kind of get them out of power. So the Corbyn project persisted. I mean, I know lots of people who are like, no, look, I'm not anti-Brexit. I think it's fine, but I'm kind of whatever about it. But, you know, a lot of people are kind of anti-Brexit, which is to say a lot of the kind of middle-class metropolitan activist base, young people especially, who were like, well, okay, so let's try to keep these two plates spinning at the same time. And that was impossible, because they ultimately led to Corbyn's endorsement of a so-called people's vote, which is to say, to rerun the election because they didn't like the result. And that lost them huge support, because it's like if you can't take people's vote seriously and say, well, look, maybe I disagreed with it, but I'm going to honor it at the very least, then I don't know how you can ask them for your vote again and say, well, I'm going to honor it and drive through these policies. Left tries to be too nice and not hard ass enough, and be like, look, we're going to be mean and we're going to do this one thing that we said we're going to do, and we're going to focus on that.
Go ahead, Matt. Yeah.
One thing I'm curious to get your take on is, I don't have much disagreement in terms of like the qualitative scoreboard as things have not closed. It's not lost on me that probably has moved the needle as much as the AFL-CIO coming out for a ceasefire, the guy setting himself on fire recently. So I feel like we're kind of lost spinning our tires in impotence. But one qualitative difference I want your take on is the UAW. And we have Sean Fain and other members of leaders of the UAW talking about things like, taking back more of your time from bosses. And I think, we talked with the Valley Labor Report guys last week. A lot of that is a product of these millennial left, or at least this time period of seeing some of these things play out. I'm curious your take on if you notice a qualitative change and the significance about there. And also, to get to this whole thing of like, are we over-egging the pudding so much? And I think the Gaza ceasefire demand is, I think something like, I think the righteousness is pretty unimpeached. But is that something that's, is that an example of, previously the unions have not taken a strong stance on the Vietnam War. And I'm curious, like, is that like strategically, I'm just curious to put that in the context of what we've been talking about the past 45 minutes.
I mean, I'm going to make myself unpopular, but that's I guess not a problem. I don't think there's anything to be gained, particularly for the left. I mean, in the cause of socialism, through militating around the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think it's absolutely right that they should call a ceasefire, but there's a huge range of questions about what next. The Israel-Palestine conflict is not the key to the imperialist international world system. It's actually kind of a small local conflict which isn't expressive of anything wider, and that there is no hope for Palestinian liberation. It's a lost cause, unfortunately, and it's terribly tragic for the Palestinians. But and I hope that I think there's probably more prospect of a solution coming from within Israel, and even that looks really, really unlikely. So I just think there's a funny thing with the unions where there's like a kind of split between kind of the workerist thing where it's like, no, unions should only focus on wages and should be political at all, right? Which I don't agree with. I mean, the kind of Lenin's critique of economism is very apposite here, in terms of there's a kind of a certain conservatism in that of not trying to speak beyond your your realm and not be too political. But the problem is that a lot of the way that unions end up being political today tends to be, and for lack of a better way, like a kind of woke concern. I don't think it's going to start through Palestine, right? And it's actually interesting. One of the other reviews, this is in the New Statesman by Will Davis, of the same books that I reviewed. So I had to kind of look at them after having written my thing. That he also looks at kind of the movement around Palestine now as a potential rejuvenation for the left, and how that might emerge, and it is able to speak for those who are unable to represent themselves. Now, nothing good has ever come on. Like, nothing good has ever come from the past 30, 40 years of politics like this, of people of the left trying to represent kind of deserving victims over there, right? It creates a kind of moralistic politics which is never rooted and has no connection to the material interests of the working class and the people they're trying to represent. So, I just think that's a kind of a political dead end. Now, I do think that from an extremely low base, but uptick in labor militancy in the U.S. is one of the few exciting things going on, particularly because it's in the U.S. I mean, it's still, matters more what the U.S. left does than any other left anywhere else. I hate to say, but that remains the case. And so I think, leader of the UAW, has a kind of militancy to him, which I think hasn't been seen in a while. I think that's all to be welcomed, and that's good. But if you're going to jump to being, kind of into more political activism, there's many steps before you start trying to resolve what's going on in Palestine. I mean, I think I think it's totally legitimate to campaign in the U.S. for the U.S. to stop funding Israel. In fact, there's kind of Israelis who want that as well. So I think that's entirely kind of legitimate. But again, you can't do everything. So you're going to have to pick your battles.
We might have some disagreement over this, but I think a similarity is we were on DM25's channel the other day, and they're asking us about what's going on in the U.S. and Palestine. And one of the things that I was saying is that it is extremely impressive, all of the mobilization around this issue in this country, and I think that it's important to not treat it as spontaneous, right? Actually, a lot of this has actually been the groups like DSA sort of having more presence in a lot of organizations, parts of the country. But I think it's undeniably clear that is this going to necessarily be good for the left? I don't really see this being something that's bringing people into quote unquote socialist organizations or anything like that. And I think that's a very fair point. So that's not an argument just to say hey, you shouldn't be protesting or marching, participating in this kind of politics. But I do think it's there's a lot of energy going on, and understandably and justifiably. But don't mistake that for what it is that we need to be doing. But I wanted to be very, very clear about one thing that Matt was getting into with the union stuff, is that because we're talking about this failed political movement. And now that we're getting towards the end of the interviews, we're either supposed to be really pessimistic or really optimistic. And one of the points here is that one thing that's going on in the U.S. at least, and I'm not sure as much in other countries, but the UAW, not trying to blow up anybody's spot or anything like that, but it's filled with a lot of people who are radicals, come out of these socialist organizations, were part of these movements, who are now doing this work of not just the ceasefire. Let's almost drop that for a second. Taking on the big three auto companies and winning with a really radical strategy. They're now moving very rapidly across the Southeast, which for people who aren't as familiar, that's where all of the union jobs went from Detroit in the North to the ununionized South. Now the UAW is really aggressively recruiting and growing significantly. So I'm really down on this past period of left populism. I get really frustrated because I see a lot of people who want to do left populism again. Oh, we just need another Bernie Sanders. We need another Jeremy Corbyn. And I just think that's a disastrous way to look at it. I even look at an organization like this. Sorry, I'm front loading this a lot, but just I'm putting out my perspective on these things. I look at an organization like the Democratic Socialists of America. Yeah, all the things that people say about it, generally true, right? There's a lot of like middle class politics, very much gets very fixated sometimes on like cultural politics, and things like that. And there used to be a lot of hesitancy about like taking on the Democratic Party. That hasn't shifted dramatically, and that organization's in dire financial straits, and who knows what's going to happen next. But as somebody who follows it closely, man, there are factions that have more influence and power in the organization, that I think have a much more materialist viewpoint than existed back in 2016, 2017. So like anyways, like a lot of people who came out of these movements are going into, union campaigns, and not just like, infiltrating, but like entering into it, working their way up, being influential members of it by doing good work. Within the American left, I think there has been a kind of recognition of this importation of like radical liberalism, or whatever you want to call it. So anyways, just like, I think that there is a truth that this left populism moment is certainly over. But I do think coming out of it, a lot of people sort of had this practical experience, or just learn, okay, well, this shit doesn't work. We can't open up, meetings with having to explain our entire life story and all the different ways we might be oppressed, visibly or invisibly. Anyway, like I think that like there is a case for optimism to be made in a very bleak time, that at least some of that stuff got defeated so much, that we can hope that maybe what's coming next will be stronger. But I don't know if you shared that experience, or
well, I did think it was a hilarious irony that like even DSA, its budget exploded because it got overloaded with like, I don't know even what these demands were or what they were expecting the organization to do.
I think
but
you
like,
noted it with your interview with Amber, but it's just like they were acting like a state, and it's like everyone's always talking about mutual aid. People ask us to do mutual aid with our podcast, and look, I want to help folks out, but it's like we don't. First of all, there's not anything going on here money wise, but like the idea that we'd use the podcast to sort of fix the ills of you can't do that. This is for entertainment and information or whatever. Anyway, go ahead. It's just true.
I think there will always, and I want to be clear here, there will be many opportunities in the future and temptations to rerun left populism, because first of all, I think it's more populist leftism than left populism, insofar as it tries to take basically social democratic politics, but without the organizations and the dense networks of associational groups and trade unions and all the rest of it, that sustained social democracy and made it a thing, especially more in Europe than in the US, but nevertheless, that still kind of existed in terms of being able to pressure politicians in the US. So it's like trying to do this shortcut thing again, right? I don't think social democracy is possible to redo, let alone kind of do the populist shortcut to social democracy. And by populist, I mean both in terms of circumventing the kind of dense network of organizations, grassroots upwards, vertically integrated organizations with kind of some sort of hierarchy and cadres being formed and all the rest of it. But also in terms of investing in a hyper leader, this guy who kind of just by himself inculcates and represents all the values and things you hold dear, which means that they're very easy to take down, because those who ride, the one who rides in on the highest horse falls the hardest, and that remained. It's a truism, but it's and a cliche, but it remains absolutely the case. It happened with a whole bunch of kind of left populist leaders. It might even be happening to Viktor Orban now in Hungary, but that's a whole other story. But he sets up himself as a family values guy, and then kind of seems to be pardoning like a sex offender in his ranks. So like the point is that that's the problem with personalism, right? That it's very flimsy, and I think just in general trying to pursue this kind of short circuit where power is at your grasp, and it was like. The left going from not talking about power and like changing the world without taking power and all this kind of horizontal nonsense, to suddenly being so focused on power, thinking that if you just grab the kind of golden rod of the presidency, that's not a thing, but that suddenly you hold all the power. So anyway,
it is now. We're gonna make it. When I take back the White House, the golden rod of the presidency.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Sure, let's do that. But this is why it'll come along again, because there'll be some charismatic figure, or people will delude themselves into thinking that AOC is actually secretly a socialist, and once she's in power, once she's in the White House, she'll do such and such. Look, there's never a secret campaign There's no secret. There's no like secret socialist politics that someone has in their back pocket, which they sneak into power, saying, "Oh no, we're going to actually honor our international treaties, and we're going to make sure that the banks kind of retain their profits, and but then secretly, burst out the socialist politics." That doesn't happen, right? That never happens. That will never happen. So that's first of all, like the kind of to extend the gambling metaphor, I guess, that like, yeah, someone's holding the cards close to their chest and they've got pocket aces, like that doesn't happen in politics. And so when we talk about kind of the problems of organization with left populism, insofar as left populism responded to this crisis of politics, the lack of kind of the lack of party structures and all the rest of it, that this isn't just like, oh, we can rerun the thing again, but with a better candidate and just organize better, do more organizing. That's not what the kind of crisis of organization means, right? It means that there's a long-term crisis of politics, which is not going to be resolved quickly. It needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. Trade unions, political parties, we might innovate new forms, right? I don't think it's necessarily that we have to look back to the 20th century and say we need to do that specific thing. But the point is that you have to have some sort of solid base of organizations of people committed, institutionalized in a way, committed to a project and a long-term goal, and that they meet regularly and they meet face-to-face. Because when you do not have that kind of institutional setting, everything relies on vapors and vibes. And that's very ephemeral. And you can be really energetic when something seems hopeful, and you just get completely blown out afterwards, and you have a long hangover, which has happened kind of after the 1960s, is happening right now. And so, in a way, when you have kind of some institutional setting, you're outsourcing motivation to a certain extent to the organization. Now, so that means that you're turning up every day. You don't need to worry about being super energetic and throwing yourself into all sorts of activism and organizing and campaigning, because what you're doing is turning up to your branch meeting every day, and it's all organized and formalized, and people have their roles. And that doesn't mean that morale isn't important. It is morale, questions of confidence, etc. But it doesn't rely on this kind of flimsy thing of everybody being super energized and then being exhausted by an experience. So yeah, when we say organization, a crisis or the problems of organization, which this whole experience raised, it's not just like a question of tactics or a question of specific practices which you can repeat or improve. We need to reckon with the fact that politics doesn't exist. I mean, politics has come back insofar as there's a huge amount of turbulence and the elite has been shaken in its confidence. And so that has opened up a little gap for politics. But the working class was defeated. The working class was defeated across the globe by the end of the 1980s, and probably earlier, really with the kind of in the middle of the 70s and 80s. It was defeated around the globe. So there is no proletariat. There is no socialism. There is no, none of this stuff exists. These are things that we know from the past and will need to be reinvented, maybe from the ground up and maybe in novel forms. But I think only by reckoning with the depth of the crisis of where we are, a crisis which is kind of 200 years in the making, where we have to understand that a whole phase of politics that existed from, at the very least, the mid-19th century until the latter part of the 20th century, that has closed, that has come to a close. We have to kind of start anew. And so all these attempts to kind of short circuit things are as serious as saying, well, why don't the left vote for Trump? To kind of shake things up and to break, I think we should take that as seriously, which is to say, not very, as trying to get kind of Bernie Sanders elected, and then neoliberalism will end,
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like there's like 10 million things we could get to. I didn't even bring up, my bugbear degrowth or any of those weird pathologies that we've been seeing either. So
I did say growth at the start. I did say growth at the start, that the left doesn't have a
you said it, and I was like, oh, I'm about to do it. I would, we should definitely do something again in the future. I always really appreciate speaking with you, and I'm a big fan of the podcast, Buncast. People should read the piece. Will be links below. Also check out your book. I mean, is there anything else that we should be directing people to, or any episodes?
Well, I'm an editor at Damage Magazine. Should check it out. Second issue coming out soon. Some great stuff, and I'm going to have a piece in there. This stuff I was talking about institutions a little bit ago, and about how people get entertained.